All right, so we will get into our presentation then. Really excited to present John Fontaine. He leads the Enterprise Design System team at Kroger Technology and Digital. He's also the co-president of AIGA Cincinnati. And as he mentioned, he is a Buckeye and earned his visual communications degree. And he's working toward a UX management certification through the Nielsen Norman Group. So thanks for joining us tonight, John.
Yeah, thank you. Really excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, so let me know when you guys can all see it.
Yep, I can see it.
Cool. So welcome to UX Toolbox. If you remember, I will be sharing a variety of tools and techniques and some do's and don'ts around when to use them and when not to. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the agenda just so you can follow along and kind of know where we are in the talk. So we're going to start out with a really brief introduction. And then the meat of the presentation is actually deliverables, tools and techniques in 3 separate categories. So we're going to talk about tools for generating ideas early in the process. We're going to talk about some tools for user testing. And then we're going to talk about some tools for sharing results with stakeholders and developers and things like that. At the very end, I'll go through my resources. And then if we have time, we'll do some question and answer. Awesome. So Chris did an excellent job of kind of going through my rap sheet, like my resume of things that I'm working through. A fun experience to share is while I was at Ohio State, I had a chosen focus on user experience design. And I was actually able to travel over to Taiwan to present some of our solutions at the ASUS headquarters in Taipei. So I really enjoy traveling, which you'll see on this next slide. I'm the youngest of 4. I'm also an avid runner. I do half marathons pretty regularly. My girlfriend and I like to cook things and go to different restaurants around town, as well as do hiking and outdoor activities. And then on the bottom there, you can see some fun times with me and my fellow board members. As she said, I'm the current co-president of AIGA Cincinnati, and that just started this June, but I've been serving the board for around like 4 or so years. It's been a really positive force in my life. So if you want to learn more about AIGA specifically and how to get involved, feel free to reach out to me after the talk. Awesome. So let's just hop right in. So the first set of deliverables I talked about were tools for generating ideas. I like to start with a top 10 techniques. You've probably heard of a lot of these. These are things that I use on a daily basis. I'm not going to give a deep dive into every single one, but if you want to take note of this slide number and ask me about a specific one you've never heard of before, feel free to do that at the end of the talk. I will, however, hop into 2 of these top 10 to give you a better idea of how to use them and what they're for. So the first one is something called fraction notation. This is something I've learned about through a Nielsen Norman Group conference, and ever since I learned about it, I've been using it all the time. It's a really quick way to diagram potential paths that a user can flow. So it's similar to user journey map. The main difference is what you're seeing on the right, which is that fraction piece of it. So it's super simple. You put what the user sees on the top and then what the user does below that. And then you have a bunch of these fractions and you connect them all together. So that's really easy to talk about, but I thought it'd be easier to see. So what I have here in front of you is actually a fraction notation example that I can walk you through. So following the theme of tools, I mapped out what a user journey flow might look like on a site like Home Depot if someone was going to buy tools online. So on the far left, you can see that you're seeing the home page, so what the user sees on top, and what the user does on bottom, so they're searching for the item. And then you continue this process from left to right. Somewhere in the middle, you could have like a shopping cart is what the user is seeing, and what the user is doing is setting options and tapping checkout. and you will be able to diagram the entire user flow in a super simple way. What's nice about this is you can do this in a facilitated session with a lot of people in the room, for example, like a discovery, and it's really interactive. I like personally doing this on a whiteboard so that you can easily swap and move things around. But sometimes that's not necessarily available these days. So I'll go into other ways to do fraction notation just here in a minute. The other tool for generating ideas that I wanted to talk about with you guys is a tool called 6UP, 1UP. So you might be familiar with Crazy Eights if you've ever done a Google Ventured style design sprint. This is very similar to that, but I think it's a little more effective. So Crazy Eights is an exercise where you do 8 sketches, but 6UP, 1UP is an exercise where you do 6 sketches. So the purpose of 6UP, 1UP is to encourage divergent thinking by creating sketches within a time box. It's a fancy way of kind of just saying, you're trying to get as many ideas out there as you can, and then go from there. So the simple way to do this is if you do have a piece of paper in front of you, you fold it into 6 equal sections, and then you give everyone a prompt. The reason I kind of teed these up together is, say, for example, you had 6 screens identified as a part of your fraction notation. This would be a really great way to get one idea for each screen. So you pass out a piece of paper to everyone involved in the ideation session. That's, say you have 10 people in the room, they would all get their own individual piece of paper, and they're all asked to complete 6 sketches. And then it's important that you time box this session, so each sketch should only take them 1 minute. And at the very end, each person gets 1 minute to present. So like I said, if you had 10 people, it would take 10 minutes to go through and have each person present their idea. Awesome. So the title of the talk is UX Toolbox. I wanted to talk about the tools that you actually need to get these things done. I personally really love in-person facilitation. I thrived off discovery sessions where we're breaking out the sprint box. We got all the stickies up on the board and we're going through things. But we all recognize that that is not possible within COVID-19 and it's not safe. And so I've experimented a lot more with digital collaboration, and there's a lot of great advantages of it. So I wanted to go through a few of the digital tools that I have had success with. So in the upper left, you'll see a tool called Miro. You may have heard it called a different thing called real-time boards, but they're the same thing. Miro is a digital collaboration tool that you can create digital stickies and move things around, and it's great for ideation. Mural is very similar to Miro. It actually won the Google Venture Style Sprint Award for Best Collaboration Tool because it has a lot more features for facilitators. Things like summoning everyone to follow you during your cursor, which can be very important if people start to wander or if they're in their own space in this infinite whiteboard and you really need them to pay attention to a specific spot. I mentioned 6UP, 1UP. So I figured the only way to do that digitally is if you potentially had an iPad. iPads and Apple Pencils are getting a lot cheaper and more available. And so it's becoming the go-to tool for a lot of designers and illustrators. If you do have access to this, I would consider trying to do your 6UP, 1UP digitally. But if not, you can always use a mouse and your cursor. The final one I wanted to mention in the digital collaboration space was Envision Freehand. For a long time, it wasn't up to snuff. It wasn't the same feature set as Mural or Miro, but it's gotten a lot better since. So if you haven't checked it out in a while, go ahead and go to Envision Freehand and take a peek. For reference, I'll be linking to all these tools that I mentioned at the very end. So don't worry about jotting too much stuff down. I'll share out the deck. Then the 2 remaining things you see on this slide are actually mobile applications. And these are really fun for anytime you do an in-person session. So I've had a lot of trouble in the past capturing work that I've completed on a whiteboard. And so Microsoft Office Lens actually solves that really elegantly. You can download this to your phone and take a picture at any angle and it'll flatten the whiteboard into a JPEG that you can share with collaborators after the fact. Post-it Plus is also a great tool that uses your smartphone camera. If you have Post-its laid out, then you can go ahead and take a picture of those and it'll digitize them for you. It recognizes all the squares you have on the board and it turns that into a document. So next time you are in the office, post-COVID-19, if you're running a whiteboard session, make sure you get these two apps on your phone. But you don't have to take my word for it. I actually did find a really good resource called UX Tools, and they did a survey in 2019 asking what people like to use when they're brainstorming. Overwhelmingly, a lot of people said paper and whiteboard. In the middle here, you see a lot of the actual tools that people use for design. But then towards the right, you'll see that Miro pops up there as something that was emerging in 2019. Great, so the last thing I'll do for each section is go over the common pitfalls that people have when they are dealing with these types of tools. So number one is not using fat markers. This sounds kind of silly, but if you use a fine pen, not only are people not going to be able to read it when you put it up on the whiteboard, but it actually encourages you to get more detailed, and that's not the point of ideation. The point of the idea phase and the 6-up, 1-up is to get something rough, quick, and dirty that you can use for as many ideas as possible within the time box. So I really encourage you to get large Sharpies, get in there, and don't worry if it looks pretty. That dovetails into the second point, which is excluding people who can't draw. I've been in plenty of discovery sessions where the designers in the room they're knocking out like 6 to 12 sketches each, but the PMs and the devs, they just don't feel like they can or should contribute. I would recommend that you get absolutely everyone involved. You're going to be impressed with the ideas that you'll be able to get. And anyone can draw a line, anyone can draw a box. So you don't have to be Van Gogh in order to get a 6-up, 1-up completed. I've already mentioned briefly that time boxing is important, but I'll just underscore that if you give someone 10 minutes to come up with a sketch, it's going to be a lot less concise and to the point. And so time boxing the session to 1 minute a piece not only saves you from being on a Zoom call or being in a meeting room too long, but it also makes sure that people are intentional with the ideas that they're presenting. You also don't want to get married to the ideas. So I've seen this a lot, but if you are not willing to crumple up your piece of paper and throw it in the trash can, you're not doing ideation right. If you're going to get upset when people do not vote for yours as the primary solution that you want to move forward with, then you're too married to your idea. So try and make sure that you're pitching things that you're passionate about, that you think are genuinely good ideas, but you're comfortable moving away from them if the group consensus is that it's not the best option. And then the last one in this category is focusing on UI details too soon. It might sound silly, but I actually have seen people in discovery sessions putting drop shadows on things or rounding corners. The point of an ideation session is to get the concept through. It's not to get the prettiest sketch you can. So try not to focus on UI details until the next phase. Next up, I'm going to walk through a few tools for user testing and validating ideas. It's fun to ask people what user experience design is in their personal opinion. The best definition I've ever received was actually from a Nielsen-Norman Group conference where they shared this concise definition. So what they said was user experience design is evidence-based design. And I think this really is a great quote to call out for the user testing section, because what your job as a user experience professional is to do is to gather evidence that the solution that you're moving forward with will be successful. And a great way to do that is to validate your ideas with customers and with stakeholders. Again, I have a list of top 10 techniques Um, I like calling out the level of fidelity here. So you can go all the way from a paper prototype that might take you 10 minutes to put together, all the way to a test environment where you have to get devs involved. You can use techniques like heat mapping or diary studies. And then you can also skip the usability test altogether if you don't have the time or resources to do so, and do something like a heuristic audit. There's tons of people who have already completed tests, and if they have done something that is going to prove the point that you're already trying to make, you can use that as evidence instead of conducting your test again by yourself. Cool. So the two, I actually have three techniques that I'm going to do deep dives into for this section. The first one you're probably all familiar with, but it's a prototype. The purpose of a prototype is actually to make it possible to experience a flow while avoiding development costs. I think this is important to underscore because a lot of people spend way too much time on their prototype, when the reason you're actually creating a prototype is so you can get an idea in front of a customer faster, and you want it to be as realistic as possible, but you don't want to sacrifice a ton of time and energy when they'll kind of get the gist if you're halfway or medium fidelity. So my process for creating a prototype when I do it at Kroger is I create a journey map. I design every single individual screen itself. I stitch the screens together using hotspots in a browser with a tool called Envision. And then I layer on additional functionality such as sticky navigations and transitions after the fact. So I make sure all my screens are airtight before I do any actual linking and prototyping. I spoke briefly about fidelity, but I wanted to make a deeper point about it. So on the left-hand side, you'll see what I consider low fidelity. So something like a sketch, a wireframe, or a paper prototype. Those are all visual fidelity. And so that's on the low end. Whereas on the high end, you'd have illustrations, mock-ups, or a test environment. So the final bold points that I have there are actually in regards to content. So on the left-hand side, you have low fidelity lorem ipsum, and on the right-hand side, you have real final copy, something that's been approved by a copywriter, something that's ready to be in front of your audience and for users to interact with. My recommendation here on this scale is that you should use medium fidelity visuals and high fidelity content. So I'll just repeat that one more time. I really think it's important to have medium fidelity visuals and high fidelity content. And the reason I think that's important is because if your content is not high fidelity, then you're doing your user a disservice. It's really easy to prove this. Put the words lorem ipsum in front of any non-designer or someone not in the tech space, and you'll spend more time on the call talking about what lorem ipsum is than you will talking about your actual solution and getting feedback on the ideas that you have. So the closer your copy is to final copy, the better off you're going to be. This is going to save you so much time. You're going to get way more accurate responses from participants if you spend the time and investment to get high fidelity copy and then medium fidelity visuals. The reason I say medium fidelity is because it doesn't have to be exactly what you're going to ship for the prototype when it comes to the corner radius and the colors. That people don't get as hung up on, but the content, people are going to be reading that during your user test. Speaking of user tests, everyone on this call, depending on whether you're brand new to UX or you've been doing it for 25 years, has a different version of a usability test. But I think the purpose of it is to ensure that your existing solutions are ready for production by exposing potential flaws. So my recommendation here is, say you started at six up, one up, and you had 6 total ideas. You should do some prioritization and prototype 3 of those and present those to users in a usability test. I personally am not the biggest fan of doing a usability test with a single solution. You're going to learn about your solution, but if you don't present users with alternatives, they may not think of what's wrong with it, and they might not understand what flaws could be there. So you're going to present 3 different prototypes to people during a usability test, minimum of 2, and then get their feedback. And at the end, you can actually pull the things that they were gravitating towards from each solution and make sort of a Frankenstein prototype at the very end. So the process for usability tests is actually different whether or not you're doing a moderated test or an unmoderated test. So in an unmoderated test, you actually give the user a set of tasks and the user records their screen while they're completing their task on their own time. So I could send out a test this morning and the user might get to it in an hour, the user might get to it in 3 days, but I don't have to sit on the call with them while they complete the test. The opposite of that is a moderated usability test, where you're physically present. This is, to me, the preferred option. And I'll go into the pros and cons of the unmoderated test next. But the moderated test is, it can be in person, where you bring someone into the office, or it can be remote on a Zoom call, where it's just kind of a one-on-one deal with a note taker involved, and you ask them to complete a set of tasks while speaking out loud. So as promised, here are the pros and cons that I see of unmoderated testing. The biggest pro is time and money. So you'll get varying opinions on this, but it's actually less time intensive to put together an unmoderated test, because if you have 10 participants, you only have to do the setup cost once, and then you're able to have them do it on their own time. Whereas if you had 10 moderated tests, you'd be physically present for all 10 of those, and so it would take you more time. It's typically less expensive because these enterprise unmoderated testing tools will give you access to participants. But sometimes it can be a little bit more expensive depending on what license you have. The one thing I do like about unmoderated tests is it's typically in their real environment. So for example, me working at Kroger, if I ask someone to sit in a sterile conference room and shop for groceries, that's not how they typically shop for groceries. But if they're sitting in their living room and their kid is pulling on their shirt and their dog is barking while they're trying to complete the unmoderated test, that's probably a little bit more realistic. And so I think you're going to get better results. That being said, there are several cons of an unmoderated test. The biggest one is your inability to pivot. Sometimes a user will say something that's very interesting and you want to know more, but you're watching the video after the fact and you can't ask them because they've already completed the test. So when you're in person with them, you can pivot, you can ask follow-up questions. It's a really good experience, and you can kind of assess their body language. The other con of some unmoderated testing tools is because these people are paid to test, they may not be in it for the right reasons. And so you might get a lot of professional testers that have never grocery shopped, or they've never used your app, or they might not be in your demographic, and they're just going to kind of breeze through your tasks and not give you great feedback. So you got to look for ones with testers with good reviews. If you have run a test and someone didn't give you good feedback, make sure you rate that, because that's kind of like the Be Kind Rewind of the VHS era, like just making sure that you're giving back to the UX community by letting other people know that this person didn't give you good feedback. And then the last thing to mention is sometimes in an unmoderated test, you have to go a lot higher fidelity because people are less forgiving. So every single hotspot and link needs to be linked up and clickable in an unmoderated test, because they're not going to have you there to say, oh, actually click on this right-hand side instead of the left-hand side. That's just how the prototype works. When you're in an unmoderated test, you'd be surprised how forgiving participants are if you just let them know that this is work in progress and some of the functionality might not be available. The last technique to describe in the user testing and validating ideas section is an A/B test. This is really good for quantitative data. So the past two have been for qualitative data. But what you're going to do for an A/B test is actually write a hypothesis, and then you're going to mock up two different versions where you only change one variable. So you're not going to change a bunch of things and have two different flows, but you're going to have one variable different, and you're going to give a percentage of the population each one of these variants, and they're going to kind of vote with their clicks. So really good candidates for A/B tests are things that are live, and something like a live website or an app is going to give you the best result. We had a very successful A/B test at Kroger using the word featured versus sponsored. So basically, we have certain products that are monetized on our platform, and we wanted to know whether a user was more likely to click on one that said the word featured or said the word sponsor. So you could obviously do a usability test for this, but I don't think it's going to give you the level of certainty that an A/B test would do. So we ran this with our entire site traffic. 50% of the people saw the word featured and 50% saw the word sponsored. And at the end, we kind of had a very clear winner of, hey, this one has the most clicks. Not so good is things that are early on concepts and prototypes. So if you have 3 prototypes you want to test with, you're not going to do an A/B test with those. And it's tougher to get personalized content. If you really want to know how someone will interact with their type of content, it's going to be more gray areas because there's a larger portion of the population seeing each variant. Netflix famously does a lot of A/B testing with their cover photos. So if you're about to click on a new title, you're not going to see the exact same image that someone else logged in California is going to see. So they do a lot of variant and A/B testing to make sure the cover photo that they choose is actually getting the highest click-through rate that it can. So neither one of these tests is going to be great on its own, but if you combine usability tests and A/B tests, you can have a great job of validating your ideas. So the physical tools you can use to run a usability test, all you really need is a notebook and someone in the room to take notes for you while you're moderating. But there are a lot of digital tools that you can use to prototype. So from left to right, I've experienced all of these, and I've had people who are proponents for each. I personally use Sketch exclusively, and I think it's the best tool today that will allow you to create a clickable prototype. But I'm really excited about the potential of Figma and Framer because they have higher fidelity animations and things that you can work in to make your prototype look even more realistic. Bringing back up that 2019 survey that was conducted on UX tools. So Sketch is still the front runner, but Figma is catching up, and you can see all the other ones that I have represented are on this chart somewhere. So I talked a lot about unmoderated testing. A few good tools to test that out with are usertesting.com, Lookback, and UserZoom. At Kroger, we have an enterprise license to UserZoom, but my personal favorite is usertesting.com. I think they have a lot of good annotation features on the video after you get your results. So you can kind of mark where something specific happened, and I like that feature. Again, that 2019 survey has a very similar result, user testing being the most widely used tool by the people they surveyed. And then the last thing to go through is some A/B testing tools. This is something that as a UX designer, you might not have as much control over. This requires a lot of development expertise, and it requires your organization to have buy-in on the concept of A/B testing. But if you do have a champion, or if you want to be that champion, you can recommend that they look into Optimizely, Visual Website Optimizer, or Google Optimize. These all have very similar feature sets and allow you to run A/B tests on live websites. So the common pitfalls for people running user tests are something I've already mentioned, is that people strive for the perfect prototype. You might need to get a little bit closer to this if you're going to do an unmoderated test, but no prototype is going to be perfect. You could spend hours and hours and hours wiring something up, and someone will click where you didn't expect them to click. So kind of forgive yourself and go out with something that is good enough and something that will get you tangible feedback, as opposed to striving for the perfect prototype. I've already talked about using low fidelity content. Do not use lorem ipsum in your prototype. You're not going to get the feedback that you're hoping for. Not testing the test is kind of like something I've had personal experience with as well. So especially on moderated testing, what you want to do is shoot yourself a link or shoot one of your coworkers a link or get someone you trust to run through the test with you before you pay per participant. If you do not test the test, you're going to get something that happens that you weren't expecting. One time I ordered 5 usability tests for a prototype, and every single one of those 5 people got stuck on the first task because it wasn't properly worded. And so I kind of threw away money in that perspective. So I want you to confidently launch your unmoderated tests by testing the test beforehand and getting a result that you're happy with. Asking leading questions is a common problem for people running moderated tests. So it's very common for people to want people to kind of confirm what they're thinking. And so an example of a leading question is, do you like solution number 1? Because people are going to agree with you. They're going to say, yes, I like it. A better way to phrase that would be like, tell me what your thoughts are on option number 1. And so you're trying not to lead the user into a specific type of feedback just to confirm your own bias. And you also just don't want to show them a bunch of options and not be confident that what you are asking them is the right question. So the final pitfall here is not listening to user feedback. So you've done all this work to gather the user feedback, but sometimes people go in with their favorite prototype already in mind. And even though the users told them that option 2 was much better and had a lot better feature set for their needs, the designer can easily just go with number 1 and find reasons that number 1 is a better solution. So actually listen to user feedback. It's going to make your product better, and it's going to be a better end result. The next portion, so this is the home stretch. The last set of tools and techniques I have to share with you is how to share results with stakeholders. So this is another really important thing I learned while I was in the Nielsen-Norman Group conference in Austin, Texas. I really recommend that you do not ask for feedback, but you ask for approval. And so this is at this stage in the process. You're really wanting to understand whether or not your stakeholders are allowing you to move forward. You're not asking them for feedback at this stage in the process. If they wanted to give feedback, they could have done that during the generation of ideas phases or during the user testing phase. You want to be confident that you are the UX professional and you are making a specific recommendation. So you'll say, hey, I would like to move forward with this solution because users gravitated towards it and it resonated with users the most. Are you comfortable with me moving forward with a solution? That's asking for approval. If you just walk into the meeting and you've done all these user tests and you open the floor of an hour-long meeting and you just say, hey, what do you guys think of solution number 1? You're going to get a lot of stuff that you weren't ready for, and you might need to go back to the drawing board. So if you've invested the time and effort and done your tools and techniques correctly, you should have an educated recommendation that you want people to move forward with. The top 10 techniques that I have for sharing results are here. I am biased towards design system being a really good way to share final designs with people. So that's similar to red lines or style tiles. Those are good ways to hand off final designs. But more often than not, UX designers will stay in this left-hand column. So they'll share things like a stakeholder map, a data report card, or a service blueprint. Speaking of stakeholder maps, this is a really good way to understand how to talk to your audience. All stakeholders are not created equally. So you're trying to kind of use this exercise to figure out which stakeholders are the most important and how do you talk to them. So on the left-hand side, you'll see I've listed the names of all the potential stakeholders in an example project. And on the top, I've listed the words impact, influence, and interest. What you're gonna do when you run this exercise is you give each person a score between 1 and 5 for each of the 3 categories. How do you determine that score? Well, you can ask yourself these questions. So let's say you're trying to score 5 different stakeholders. You'll ask yourself, who will gain the most if this project is a success? This is typically the user, actually. So sometimes you're thinking like, oh, my boss will be really happy if I complete this project. But what you should really be asking yourself, is the user the primary stakeholder, and will it impact them the most? If it does, if they're impacted the most, you give them a high score, 5 out of 5 in that category. The next one is influence. So who has the final decision-making power? This typically is someone internal, and you want to identify that person up front before going into any meetings. And then interest, who wants to be involved? Or who will champion this effort after you present? This is really important if you work at a large organization. If someone is interested in your project, get them in the room and make sure they understand what process you went through so that they'll basically advocate for your work when you're not in the room. And so that's a really good path. So you're looking for people that have high scores in all 3 of these categories. The last thing I wanted to share is something called a research report. And there's a lot of ways to do this, but I'm really happy with this specific format. So the purpose of a research report is to communicate the results of a usability study to stakeholders. So you've already done your 6-up, 1-up, you've already created your prototype, you've tested it with the users, and you've identified your stakeholders. The final step on the UX train is for you to communicate those results to your stakeholders. And so I recommend that you create a slide deck with the following format. On the very top, you're going to want to title each finding with a meaningful phrase. If you just write the word finding number 1 at the top, people are not going to remember that, and it's going to get lost in the shuffle. So the example here is switch to room view wasn't noticed. That's a really good way to title each finding. You're then going to rank the severity of the finding. Is this high, medium, or low? All high severity findings are something where it literally prevented the user from completing a core task. If it's medium severity, it probably was a relatively large sticking point, but they were still able to figure it out with time. If it's low, it was an inconvenience, but they kind of shrugged it off, and it's something that isn't super important that we fix right away. Other examples of high severity findings are any accessibility issues. So once you rank the severity, you're going to describe the finding and then make a recommendation. The final 2 things to include on this slide, I like pulling out user quotes, something that they actually said during the test. I think it's a really good way to put a human face on your finding. And then you want to include an annotated screenshot. People are very visual, and if they don't have something to look at, or they don't know what part of the interface you're referring to, it's going to be difficult for them to action on the change you want them to make. So the physical tools for creating a stakeholder map, I've already said I like to do a stakeholder map on a whiteboard, but you don't need to do that. You can do it in a spreadsheet or a Google Sheet. The digital tools that I typically use for my research reports are anything you use to make a slide deck. So obviously you can use PowerPoint. I prefer Google Slides, but another alternative I wanted to bring up is you could technically just drop these research reports directly into Jira. The tool you use already is probably the best tool for the job. So if you're forcing someone to go somewhere that they don't normally check, that you're just introducing an additional area or a boundary for them to interact with your work. So if you want to create a slide and then post it in their Jira story, that's going to be a great way to interact with developers. The common pitfalls for sharing results that I've seen a lot, the top one is giving a tour. So when you're presenting your work, whether that be a final mockup or a usability test, you don't want to just describe what you're seeing. So I've definitely seen people say, the logo is on the upper left. Next to that, you'll see a list of links. Below that, you'll see a header image. And below the header image, I have body copy. You get the idea. That would be an example of giving a tour. What you want to do instead is focus on the areas of the interface that need edits, that need changing, and describe why they need to be changed or what rationale you used to make that specific design decision. Another pitfall is not sharing your process. So I've seen a lot of people go into a usability sharing session and jump right into the results. You're doing yourself a disservice because you want to spend at least 10 minutes at the top of the call describing how you got to where you are today and what work you've already put in. This will just make sure that everyone's on the same page and they understand that you've tried alternatives and that this is something that you have arrived at through rigor and something you did intentionally, not just something you're recommending or pulling out of a hat. The third thing is prioritizing all findings equally. So like I've already said on the severity ranking, if you don't give your findings a severity ranking, you might be disappointed on what gets worked first. So the reality of being a UX designer is not everything you recommend will get built immediately. And so you have to identify, it's part of your job description to figure out what the highest priority findings are and put those in a different bucket than something that could get around to maybe a year or so. You also don't want to show unedited test footage. If you were in a room with a user for an hour and you try and show that hour-long footage to a group of stakeholders, you're going to bore them to sleep. So if you have the capabilities to edit test footage on your machine, I recommend making a sort of highlight reel or finding common trends and just pulling out that section to share with people. Because you should share video footage if you have it, just not an unedited video. And then the last thing to bring up is you should not say consider or possibly. This sounds kind of strong, like hard-headed or a little stubborn, but it's just a framing technique that makes sure people are understanding that your recommendations are based on research and not something that they can kind of ignore because they don't believe in UX. So if you say, I would consider moving the button below the fold because of XYZ reasons, that's going to be a lot less likely to happen than if you say something like, we should move the button below the fold because I have research that shows that will increase conversion. So just something to think about. And yeah, those are the common pitfalls for sharing results. These are a few resources that I used to craft this talk. So obviously the Nielsen-Norman group that I've attended, I highly recommend you jump on that bandwagon while they're doing remote sessions. It's a little cheaper than trying to fly out somewhere. I also have linked an article called the Remote Sprint Guide. A few design systems like Workday have some good tools and techniques that you can check up. And then the final two resources I unfortunately can't link to because they are physical books, but they have been really helpful throughout my career. So if you want to learn more about the Path to Impact or Design Thinking Field Guide, feel free to reach out to me after the talk. These are all the digital tools that I've covered during the course of this talk and links to those as well. So when I share this out to the list of attendees, you can click through, get a free license. If you're not a company and you just want to do one or two things, you can probably try out each one of these tools and see which one works best for what you're trying to accomplish. Thanks for listening. That's all I had for you today, but you can feel free to ask me anything and we'll open up the floor for Q&A.